All right. Well, I want to welcome all of our participants back into the Zoom seminar. I'm still at Flyleaf Books. Joanna, you need to mute your there. I I think now Joanna and I are at Flyleaf Books, and Max is at home, and Ariane is at home, and we are going to continue our discussion of religious freedom and what it means in the contemporary world. And I'm going to begin by asking our speakers to address a common question, and then we will open up the floor to questions and comments from the whole community of people who are with us this morning. So I welcome you back to the conversation. So I want to begin with a very large question about the meaning of religious freedom and its value, because during much of human history, religious freedom has not been a core cultural value. People within a particular society or cultural community were expected to more or less have the same religion, and heresies were not permitted, or religious diversity was not always emphasized, although sometimes it was. So I want to just begin with a question. Why do you think religious freedom is a good cultural value? And do you think religious freedom is still highly valued in the societies that you look at? So I want to begin with this general question. Why should we defend religious freedom when much of history has not defended religious freedom? And maybe I'll begin with, we'll kind of go in the order of the people who spoke in the seminar. So Max, I want to ask you to begin.
Oh, Lloyd, I'm not a morning person. This is hard for me. That's a tough question. No, but yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. And I would, my take on it is a little bit different. And I think what we've seen in this is when we term this, when we analyze this in the realm of religious freedom and keep thinking about it in this context of states and the rights of citizens and how does this work, it makes me wonder, is there another way to get to the same result without engaging in the same theoretical discussion? And again, I might be working in the sort of Shangri-La way, but is there a way to emphasize empathy and compassion for other people without and have that be the basis? Again, we're getting the problem of codification. I am living in this sort of abstract world of a fantasy world in which we could institute ways in which our society were more empathetic and compassionate and understanding of other people's desires for freedom of practice of anything, right? And this gets into a lot of things like drug use, whatever it is, practices that we've seemed to have codified, some way of saying that a sense of personal respect for other people's decisions that would somehow regulate your own behavior so that your behavior doesn't impact others. I guess what I'm saying is, like, I'm not sure that from what I've heard in all of these talks, that the issue is solvable in the philosophical realm that's going to satisfy everybody when we talk about whether you have religious freedom or not. And so again, I'm not offering the solution, but I wonder if the solution is to figure out a way to get to the same result outside of resolving this sort of secular religious expression tension. Should we defend religious freedom? Yes, we should defend religious freedom in the sense that as it exists within human behavior and human interaction with other humans. I guess what I'm saying is it's a social issue more than a personal issue to create a society in which this question is just part of the overall do unto others as you would have done to yourself. So use a very religious golden mean here. Yes, we should defend religious freedom, but I think by defending it within the theoretical framework, we end up kind of going in the same rabbit holes. And I'm not sure if that's resolvable. So it's a little bit of like wishful thinking that we could find some other way around it.
Ariane, I want to ask you the same question. Is religious freedom an essential value, and why is it so challenged seemingly in China?
Yeah. So I think I would actually take kind of, sorry, I'm gonna put in my earphones so you can't hear my child in the background. I'm actually going to take kind of an opposing view from Max. I think what Max said works great in societies where we already have basic rights guaranteed and where people can be assured that they can go through the system of like the courts and receive a just verdict at the end. That's not, I mean, if you listen to the lecture last night on China, that's not the case in Xinjiang right now. You speak up, you disappear for years, at least if you're Uyghur or another minority. So people don't have that basic guarantee. And I think that basic guarantee is really important because, as I mentioned last night, religion was not always an issue. Religion is something that's being picked on now. And it is so politicized. And it's also really wrapped up in culture too. People can oppress religion in the name of I mean, in the name of politics, in the name of extremism, in the name of trying to create a unified national culture. So religion is not in this, it's not a simple arena. And I think we do need freedom of religion and freedom of religious expression because it otherwise kind of gets, I mean, with like, as with Hobby Lobby and other places, it really, these rights can be infringed on from a number of angles. And I think another thing that I really wanted to bring up today after listening to Johanna's talk too, is that we can't, in an ideal world, we can't pick and choose our darlings. So in China, we see that like China funded the Taliban, funded the Mujahideen, which the US also did in the 1980s in Afghanistan. And then of course, that China worked with the Taliban to try to extradite these supposed Uyghur terrorists who were in Afghanistan. So there's never a clear relationship between religion and the state, and even related religious groups or related religious ideas and the state. And Johanna, I think, mentioned that a lot too. And in the US, I think a lot of people on the left are very critical of Hobby Lobby and Hobby Lobby's refusal to grant birth control to individuals, but at the same time, they do want people, sorry, I don't remember the exact name, like Native American religious leaders to be able to use peyote. And so I think we're at we do need some very clearly defined boundaries because we often end up self-contradicting, we meaning us, China, people on the left, people on the right, often end up self-contradicting ourselves.
Thank you, Ariane. That's a very good point that, you know, that it's not a simple either or. There are ways in which issues in the United States may be, we say that's terrible, they're repressing religious freedom in China, but then there may be some problematic aspects to our own policies. Joanna, what are your thoughts about why this should be a value and how complicated it is to sustain it?
Mm. Well, I mean, there's so much compelling has already been said. And I really, there are different things that both of you drew to the surface there that resonate with me. I really tend to agree with our founders that this freedom of to decide how you are going to frame your relationship to the universe, it is an inalienable individual right. But I say that, and as a scholar of religion, what I hear in that is a Protestant leaning that says religion is individual, religion is internal. And so something that I struggle with as someone who studies this is how to conceive of what religious freedom would look like for traditions where religion is public and communal and institutionalized. And that's a tension that I have been wrestling with for years, and I have not found a resolution to yet. As far as the question of whether religious freedom is respected in the United States, I think it is. I think it's even probably fetishized, by which I mean that we lose a clear portrait of what it is that we're actually after in pursuing religious freedom. And I know I just highlighted this a lot, but I think right now we're at a moment where our focus is so honed in on the freedom of religious organizations that we've kind of lost sight of individual religious freedoms and of the religious freedoms of minority groups that are being kind of routinely tossed by the wayside, just because they are different from the norm. So yes, religious freedom is cared about a lot, but I think there are distortions in how we discuss it in America.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to follow up here. There was a comment by Jonathan Gerard about the nature of what he called power and authority. And I think the question is, can we have democratic societies that protect religious freedom in ways that do not impose a particular conception of power on individuals in that society? In other words, how do we balance power and rights in ways that do not infringe upon the individuals in that society? And it seems abstractly to be possible, but is there any way that we can guarantee that this is actually going to work? Because even if we claim there's religious freedom, there are subtle ways in which power and authority are imposed upon people. Does anybody have any thoughts about that perspective?
I do, and also in answer to what Johanna just said about communal practice of religion, I don't think that there is a good answer. So, of course, in Xinjiang, Uyghurs were traditionally Muslim, particularly kind of a Sufi strand of Islam. And a lot of religious practices are community practices. They're festivals, they're way people go about their everyday life. They structure how they structure individual relations, societal relations, markings of the year. And so religious freedom, in a way, would need to protect those community practices of Islam. At the same time, what happens to religious minorities among the Uyghurs? And I think we do get into there is definitely an issue here, because by protecting the religious freedoms of a minority group in let's say a secular state, when you're protecting community freedoms, there's always the issue of individual freedoms within that group. What about people who decide to be secular? What about the minority of Christians? So there were a number of Swedish missionaries in Xinjiang in the 1930s. And I don't have a good answer for that, but I think there does need to be a balance.
Does anybody else want to respond?
Well, I'm not sure if I'm addressing your question head on, Lloyd, but when you talk about power and the rights, who has power, just assume the government has power. What is that power? I was trying to list them out, like, well, taxation and regulation of behavior, right? What other ways that governments have power? And we think of the rights, okay, rights to worship, rights to freedom of conscience. One question that's in there is duties, that's not in there. Like, maybe if we flip the idea to also, like, what is the religious, if you have religious rights given to you, what are the duties that are implicit upon institutions and individuals to exercise that? And when it comes to government power, I mean, this is really getting into the question of the government can't tell religions what to do. That's clearly not freedom of religion. But it again, I'm not sure if I'm addressing your question, but I just thought about that notion that, again, it's putting the burden on the religious institutions to say, if I've been accorded rights through a governmental system, every citizen that is accorded rights is also accorded duties of citizenship. And so the same thing could be the relationship between, the state and religions. How to define those duties and still maintain religious freedom, I have no idea, but I just philosophically wonder if that could be added to the equation to somehow get to a sense of personal and institutional responsibility across religions, ecumenically shared, this notion that we all have a duty to somehow make this relationship between the power structures and our freedom satisfying for as many as possible. It's like our duty to share religious freedom as something that religions need to take on for other religions. Again, I'm not sure how that works in any institutional framework relationship with the government, but philosophically, I think duties is some way of thinking about this and how we might resolve some tensions.
Any other thoughts, Joanna?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting proposal, Max. I'm going to be thinking about that one for a while here. So something that this makes me think about is about the amount of power that's wielded by religious institutions, right? Max, you were just listing off some of the ways a state deploys power. Taxation. Well, many religious organizations demand tithing. People can be expelled if they break the rules. You know, there are these kind of soft powers that religious institutions have. And I'm very curious about the way that this power can be either amplified or squashed by how the state responds to it. So, you know, one example that comes to mind is of the Catholic abuse scandal, where by and large, civil authorities in the United States for decades were getting reports of abuse and were saying, we trust the Catholic Church to handle this in-house. And yet, you know, there are other cases where we have the US government responding to religious power by going in and, you know, bugging mosques in New York, or labeling the Nation of Islam as a cult and monitoring its behavior. And so it's very interesting to see how the state responds to what it clearly perceives as the sizable power of these religious organizations, and where it sees a threat in that power or a kind of ally in that power.
Okay, thank you. This is just one more follow-up from Jonathan about how we define our communities as tribal groups. And he asked, do we humans, do we find a way to transcend tribalism? That is religious difference also a kind of outcome of tribalism, and that somehow we have to evolve beyond tribalism to get beyond religious intolerance? Does that make sense as a category of religion as a form of tribalism? And therefore, it is also a form of self-protection in the evolutionary process. Any thoughts on tribalism and religious identities?
Well, I just want to thank Jonathan for trying to help me out with the moving towards some Shangri-La where we evolve out of our tribalism, if you will. I think the problem is that, and I think tribalism might not be the right word for it. I think you're always up against situations of inequity, and this always happens whether it's, you know, economic or you know, use of power, you know, to persecute people, and this exists outside of the religious realm altogether. When there are power inequities, we have these problems. All of this talk of religious freedom is really about the exercise of power, as you said, and about, you know, and people feeling either unfairly treated or impotent in the face of power. My sense is that, you know, unless we have some utopian vision where everyone is absolutely equal and no one has power over anyone else, not going to happen. That I'm not sure that you can really transcend it. What might be called religious tribalism could just be recreated in any number of ways in which there's power inequities.
And any number of ways in which identities are defined, so that political tribalism is just as powerful and intolerant as religious tribalism.
So I guess my point is my original opening statement about, you know, imagine there's no, you know, it's not quite as easy.
I appreciate that that perspective. Any other thoughts about how religious identity might be linked to tribalism?
Absolutely. So I am so struck in hearing this comment and hearing Max reflect on kind of this dream world in which we can transcend this tribalism, of how much this dream was like seized onto by folks from the 1700s through the early 1900s, who saw this vision of religion. The Transcendentalists are a good example of this, who saw religion as generally progressing towards just one universal religion. As every religion evolves a little closer to the truth, we would all somehow get to the same exact point. And that has not happened. It has not happened. And I think some of that speaks to this tribalism. My best hope is that we can edge away from tribalism towards a place where we can embrace the beauty of difference, while still striving hard towards that kind of equality that Max already acknowledged. It's an asymptotic goal for sure. But is there a way to have that kind of difference while setting aside fierce tribal loyalty? I hope there is.
I think one of the main elements of a tribal identity, if we may use Jonathan's term on this, is that it gives you some sense of security against threats, something that's outside of your world that is threatening. So if we move away from tribal religious identities, we're probably still going to need some kind of identity affirming category that gives us a sense of safety, of belonging, of participation, right? So I was actually going to follow up on one other thing that Joanna said about the idea of coming out of the Enlightenment, that we may be moving toward a common shared belief or some kind of reason. And this was at the heart of so-called modernization theory in the 1950s and 1960s, that as societies become more modern, they become more secular, and therefore religious conflicts will diminish. And modernization theory seems to have gotten that one wrong, at least in the short run. It hasn't evolved that way. Ariane, do you have any thoughts about this issue of identity or tribal protection, or even an evolutionary need to belong to a group, and how that affects religious identities?
Yeah, it's quite complicated in Xinjiang because, of course, the Uyghur diaspora has latched onto this Islamic identity as one of their defining traits of being Uyghur, particularly in diaspora. And at the same time, I think that has allowed the state to also define this people and define them as potentially subversive and potentially dangerous. So this tribalism really goes both ways. It can both be used by a group to establish their identity and to create some idea of internal cohesion. And internal cohesion, and I think, as Johanna also mentioned, standards for group behavior, especially if they are a minority within a state. But at the same time, it can also be used by states. And I think we just talked about that, or Joanna just talked about that today with like the Mormons and Jews and others in the US, can be used by states to define and discriminate against groups. So it's there is no easy answer to anything. Everything is.
That is an eloquent description of the humanities in general. There is no easy answer, but we're going to keep digging away at it. But I appreciate what you said, that the tribalism goes in both directions. That is the scapegoating of religious minorities, as well as the identification of people within those groups. I want to convey a question now. This is from, I think, from Bob Kuykendall, who notes that no matter how carefully laws are drawn in the United States about religious freedom versus society, the interpretation is usually settled by a single group of judges. That is, the values and beliefs of these judges powerfully override whatever vague line is drawn in the separation of church and state. Could you comment on this narrow group of judges deciding for all the rest of us what counts as religious freedom, basically? So Joanna, that sounds like it may be a US question.
It is. I mean, it's crazy. It's a crazy, crazy responsibility that we are throwing at the feet of the Supreme Court judges, or justices rather. And something I found so striking was that in Amy Coney Barrett's confirmation hearings, when some of her questioners brought up issues like abortion or like gay marriage, which, you know, the Catholic Church has a stated stance against, which she is on record commenting on in the past, those comments were flagged by some, those questions were flagged by some commentators as being by nature anti-religious questions, that to ask questions about her religious values was just showed anti-religious bias. And that was shocking to me, because this is someone we are entrusting for many, many, many decades to arbitrate religious freedom. And she, you know, I think it's a pretty wonderful thing to have both folks with religious convictions and without religious convictions, or with convictions of atheism or agnosticism, together on the court deciding these in concert. But the idea that questions of religion would be were off the table because they were private questions seemed to me to represent a fundamental misunderstanding of what's happening on the Supreme Court, which is, as you said, Lloyd, these 9 individuals bringing not only their legal expertise and background, but also their personal sets of values and beliefs to bear on the religious freedoms of every American.
Yeah, if I could just jump in on that, what I was thinking about this is, what's the alternative? Like, you know, religious freedom by referendum, right? You know, religious, and so, you know, you have to have some way of getting it to, you know, getting the initiatives from citizens through the political processes to make decisions about, you know, how the relationship between the state and religion. At some point, there's a reasonable place, maybe between, you know, an ultra Catholic Supreme Court and referendum, that this could be mitigated. So by the time it comes to the Supreme Court, it's clear what the Constitution is demanding. But, you know, I think that the issue right now, putting it all on the Supreme Court like that, I mean, frankly, scares me to no end, especially the particular brand of Catholicism that we see in the Supreme Court. I know that in my talk, I talked a lot about Catholicism, and I painted Catholicism in not a very happy light. That was only because I was showing why secularism in France is the particular sort of militancy has to do with the relationship with the Catholic Church. To be clear, and I'm taking a little aside here, to be clear, Catholics are of all types. The people I love the most in the world are Catholics. My entire family are Catholics. You know, I was raised Catholic. I'm an apostate who didn't get confirmed, but I did all the rest of it. And so, you know, it's just that it's, to put it in a body of people is absolutely dangerous, especially when you have, you know, they don't even represent their religion, if I might be so bold as to say that. They don't even represent the Catholicism that we know is out there, that it's the Catholicism of Vatican II, and is much more of what we might call a liberal Catholicism. And just to be clear, in the 19th century, 2 names that I didn't mention are names like Lamennais and Montalembert. These were social and liberal Catholics in the French system who very much wanted separation of church and state in the 19th century for reasons of religious liberty and freedom, but also to enact a Catholicism that was very much not the Catholicism that I was talking about in the 19th century. And I know there's a lot of difference between 21st century Supreme Court justices, but they're very much more closer to the 19th century version of Catholicism that I was talking about than the Vatican II Catholicism that's out there. So it is dangerous, but it's not that they're Catholics, it's that they're a very particular strand of Catholics on the Supreme Court.
So, Ariane, this isn't about the Supreme Court in China, but as compared to how things are settled in China, if you look at the 2 systems, who plays the role of the Supreme Court in China on deciding what's going to count as religious freedom or as the rights of religious groups? Is it better or worse than what we're talking about with the judicial system in the US?
So if we're talking about let's say like the 1950s, China did create, there was a China Islamic Association with everything is state appointed in China, with these state the state appointed board, which I think, as I mentioned yesterday, had a bunch of Sunni Chinese speaking Muslims, which are a different, very different ethnic group. They've been in China, they've been Chinese for centuries. Um, and I think the only person on the board who was Uyghur, even though Uyghurs were half of the Muslim population, was a secularist. Um, so for a long time, this board dictated what a mosque would look like, what would be taught in the religious institutes, what brands of Islam the state would support. But of course, China has a very hierarchical government system. So it is Beijing that decides what happens. Xi Jinping has much more power than anyone else in China. Um, at the same time, China is vast. And so we do see these issues of things being decided at a national level, but not always being implemented at the local level. And that was very true up until about, let's say, 12 years ago in China, where you still had local mosques operate in Xinjiang, operating as they always had, as long as they were far enough away from the officials' eyes, like local shrines with imams who were supported not by the government but by local funds, and that existed until the state turned their eyes on them. So it's a much different power structure.
Do the Uyghur communities identify more with the Sunni branch of Islam or with some other branch of Islam?
So if you ask Uyghurs, they would say that they are Sunni, but then if you actually, I think Ryan Thum and some other ethnographers have started to look at practices. The practices among Uyghurs include, and Kyrgyz and Kazakh include, a lot of folk practices. So you'll see these almost shrines. They look like they have Tibetan prayer flags, but they're Uyghur shrines out in the middle of the desert, and special festivals and customs. And people, because of the information blockade in Xinjiang, like when I was in Xinjiang, people would say, oh, these are Islamic customs. But if you talk to Muslims from Turkey, even, where there is also state-supported Sunni Islam, these are not Islamic customs. They are Uyghur cultural customs that have been around for hundreds of years. And people would kind of justify them or give them legitimacy by calling them religious customs. So again, this actually kind of nicely connects to what Joanna was talking about earlier today, in that there are certain things, like we now associate or the pro-life movement with evangelical Christians, and this is a religious issue for them now, but it wasn't 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. So this boundary between culture and religion is constantly shifting, and what people identify as a religious belief or a religious practice is also constantly shifting.
That's an excellent point, that there always overlap with cultural practices, cultural traditions, values that go beyond a specific theological position. And this actually leads us to our next question, which is from Vandy Bredau. And she makes this point: it appears to me that a lot, maybe even most, of what might be termed religious discrimination is actually cultural discrimination. What are your thoughts about this? I'm thinking mostly in the US, for example, political correctness, but of course, is this applicable elsewhere? That what counts as religious discrimination is really a kind of cultural distrust or cultural discrimination. Thoughts on this?
Well, I think certainly in the French case, I hope that was sort of a central point of mine, was to say that, in fact, laïcité, the government policy of laïcité, because of its inconsistencies in the application of separation of laïcité, separation of church and state, clearly has been cover for, in my contention, and I'm not alone in this, for, cultural prejudice, racism against, these people, as they say in France, Français de souche, real French people, whether you're, whatever your religion is, look a certain way and act a certain way and step in line. So absolutely, I think, in the French example, it's definitely an issue of cultural prejudices. In the United States, I think it's a matter of, where do these issues come up? Yes, there might be sort of I think political correctness might be sort of a cultural way of saying, like, I don't like these religions because they're patriarchal and that's not, whatever. But that's like those are individual opinions. But when we're talking about institutions, and we're talking again, but going back to what you said earlier, the use of power and religious institutions. And I don't see those as those dynamics between the federal government and Hobby Lobby or, religious institutions to be cultural as much as institutional relations, institutional problems being figured out. No doubt cultural prejudices are influencing politics and are influencing the way that individuals interpret this and act on, when they get information about religious liberty questions, they're going to act on them based on their cultural and personal prejudices. But in the United States so far, they seem to just be the government is trying to do policy and people are reacting to that policy with claims of religious liberty. I think in France, the policy has been much more pointedly, a cultural prejudice. So that's my distinction based on the French case.
So let me ask others, cultural discrimination, how do we draw the line between cultural prejudice and religious discrimination? I guess they do often connect. Other thoughts, Joanna?
There is so much overlap between those two. I completely agree. And I think, if I had to wager, I would guess that a lot of anti-religious sentiment in this country against religious minorities starts with xenophobia, starts with racism, and then seizes onto particulars of a religious tradition as a way to justify that. It's been so interesting to hear Ariane tease out this difference between what the state recognizes as culture and what the state recognizes as religion, because I feel like these categories have been at play in American history, but have not really been tugged up to the surface and named. So an example that comes to mind is anti-Catholic sentiment in the 1800s, where one flashpoint for this was in these huge public religious parades. And reformers hated these. They're loud, they're noisy, they're dirty, they represent everything that felt problematic about Catholic immigrants. No one really seemed to flag this as an issue of religious freedom because they said this is a cultural practice. And so it was fair game to tackle that. But this again leads me back to the issue of using Protestantism as a bit of as the model through which to read other religions, because I think Protestantism is kind of far on one end of the spectrum in terms of, this may not match up with how we see Protestantism in the public sphere today, but for most of American history, worship is contained in a church building. Sacred text is contained in the Bible. Prayer is a very discrete act. It can kind of be boxed up and categorized. And when you take that model and try to apply it to something like Native American religion, it just doesn't work. Where do we draw the line there between culture and religion? Within Native American cosmology and ways of thinking, farming can be a religious act. Land use is a religious act. Language is a religious act. All of these, of course, were routinely violated by the US government, which certainly did not classify them as religious issues. But this is an issue that I really wish were given more attention in an American context, because it's clearly at play.
Thank you. Ariane, do you have any thoughts about how do you draw the line between religious discrimination and cultural discrimination? You've already kind of alluded to that, but any thoughts?
So I think I talked about this in the talk yesterday. Again, this is very complicated in China because China has basically Muslims in China are basically split into two camps. You have the Chinese-speaking Muslims who are culturally much more integrated into China. They don't have their own language. Their only distinguishing feature is really that they are Muslims, and they have different ancestral backgrounds depending on where they're from. China has historically not had a huge problem with them. With Uyghurs, as I mentioned before, up through the 1990s, discrimination was cultural. This discussion of differences was split into a discussion of Islamic institutions, which were bad and predatory, and then Islamic culture, which was seen as local ethnic culture, and which the state could kind of patronize and secularize. So in the 1990s, though, when there were these threats of pan-Turkism and the Soviet Union was breaking up, and we have all these new Turkic Muslim nations appearing right on Xinjiang's borders, the state really clamped down on expressions of Uyghur culture, which, and I really look at how the state tries to garner international support for its actions. So in the 1990s, the state clamped down on Uyghur culture, but this, of course, was not going to be very popular on to international audiences. So, of course, when 9/11 happened, it very quickly switched from calling these people ethnic separatists and cracking down on Uyghur cultural practices to calling them Islamic terrorists. So I guess in the case of China, the state is very opportunist, and it will use these things indiscriminately. Sometimes, it'll patronize parts of ethnic culture when they are within state-sanctioned spaces and secularized. It will crack down on religious freedoms when they're actually cultural expressions, if these seem to be undermining state hegemony or creating strong shared characteristics with other groups outside of the state. So it's, yeah, I mean, of course, you can't, religion is a part of culture in Xinjiang. And the state will go at it from any angle that works and that finds a good international audience.
Well, thank you. I think, oh, Max, were you going to say something
I was
else?
just going to say something, this connection between culture and I just thinking back on the Third Republic when I was talking about that great campaign throughout the Third Republic to sort of homogenize and systematize and centralize the French state and the French people. This is just a side, and then putting that in the context of this sort of battle with the Catholic Church, the idea of changing culture as a way of changing the whole dynamic of the relationship between the religion and the state. That is, I think that we can see that, in the Chinese example, or like, how do you regulate culture and consider it part of religion, or set it aside and say it's okay and this isn't? This is definitely part of the whole process of, I mean, and it might go back to my original point about the Shangri-La. How do you create the social conditions and the cultural change? That's what the French state was trying to do as part of a project that had many other, as I mentioned, material aims and political aims and all sorts of other aims. But certainly one of the aims was this, this philosophical battle with the Catholic Church, and they approached it from this massive cultural change. So yeah, I think that's an interesting just side point on how culture and religious freedom worked in that particular context.
Well, one of the common themes running through all of this is that states do not like to see competitors when it comes to the exercise of power. And religion can become an autonomous center of power and authority. And this is something, of course, that goes all the way back to the Middle Ages in Europe as well. The church-state struggle is always a struggle about power. How do we balance that out? So we keep coming back to power and authority too. Paul Connick has a question related to this issue of the communal rights and the individual rights. Can you go into a little more about the tension between communal and individual religious rights? If we privilege communal rights over those of the individual, don't we risk underwriting what have often been intolerant and oppressive institutions? So I guess this is always the question, what are the rights of a community as compared to the rights of an individual? And of course, this spills over into economics and to all kinds of other behaviors, wearing a mask even. But what do you think about this? Do we give too much attention to communal rights, then individual rights are weakened? Who has a thought about Paul's question?
I'll happily jump in on that. Paul, I completely agree. I think that's a big risk. And I think one way this gets justified is by saying, you know, the folks who attend a religious service or are going to a religious organization, they're adults, they're free to walk away from this at any time. And I think that neglects what I earlier called the kind of soft power of religion, that when you're a part of a community, that does place demands on you. Those may be financial, those may be behavioral. In really extreme cases, we have religions that tell all their followers to pick up and move. And I think it's flattening the power dynamics to say, well, that religious group is not a government. They can't put you in jail. They can't kill you. You're totally free to obey or not obey. And I think also that when we prioritize individual rights more is when we are able to also prioritize the individual rights of either non-religious people or of folks who are not in a position to make religious choices. So I'm thinking in particular of this dynamic between religious parents and their children and the wild rights that that parents have to act on religious conviction, even in ways that the general law says are detrimental to their child. And that child is not able to opt in or opt out of their parents' religious beliefs. And so I think when we can if we can pull back a little from looking at the organizational structure that might justify a parent, say, denying medical care to a child, we can step back from that and say, no, we're going to look at the individual rights of this parent. It's easier to then say, and let's look at the individual rights of this child. And let's have those two be the things that we're weighing against one another.
So, Joanna, thank you for bringing that up. That's something that I wanted to say. If we don't get to it eventually, because I was really struck by Ariane saying that in China, there are laws about up to 18, you know, you're not choosing religions and things like that. And, you know, and it really is an essence of, you know, if we're talking about individual rights of individuals, what about the right to consent to religion? And of course, you know, you say this to a religious person, well, how are we supposed to, you know, drive moral, you know, foundations into our children? And this is where we learn. And, you know, and certainly, I mean, I'm not going too far out on a limb, but if you were to, at least in our society, in American society, say, let's wait till 15 before anyone gets religious education, I think we wouldn't have any religion in this country, you know, very quickly. You know, and one of the other things here is a lot of the people that are supporting the really what we might call a more conservative or right-wing approach to religious liberty are the ones who are also asserting that you know, fetuses are individuals and have rights as individuals and have rights. And so then the next step is, well, you know, but do they have rights when they're children to religious freedom? And, you know, again, we are never going to convince religions that you can't teach your kids. Obviously, we go all the way back. The biggest controversy in all of these things are schools and how you're being taught, you know, in the French case or in the United States case. But yeah, if you're going to go in the philosophical realm of individuals and their rights to agency, and you believe in things like the right to consent, and religion is such an important point, then it is something to think about, you know. It doesn't solve our issues at all, but it certainly adds another wrinkle to the conundrum of religious liberty. Children, you know, they don't have a choice.
That's right. And sometimes the state does intervene and take children out of those religious contexts or require that they be vaccinated or they get blood transfusions or whatever. These are interventions in the name of the rights of the child. Ariane, do you have any thoughts about this conflict between the communal and the individual?
Yeah, and I think so. When we're looking at religious freedoms of a community, I think it's important to actually break it down into what that means, because there are so many Protestant Protestant traditions that are really just part of American life that we don't really think about them. So if we look at the case in Xinjiang, like what people are advocating for, would be religious holidays. This is a huge problem in China right now because you can't give religious instruction to anyone under the age of 18. So what do you do about religious holidays? They're not built into the Chinese calendar. Uyghur holidays, you can be non-religious. So my husband's family is actually from Turkey. I don't think anyone in his family is religious, but they still celebrate like Ramadan. They don't fast, but they still celebrate it, and they still celebrate Korban and other holidays as cultural holidays. In China, this has become incredibly problematic. You're not supposed to celebrate. If you are under 18, how do you participate in a cultural holiday that has a religious roots if you are under 18 without the police coming in and arresting your parents for indoctrinating you in religion and turning you into a terrorist? Of course, then there are other celebrations like marriage. Marriage is usually, in most societies, it is a religious celebration. Even if people have never gone to mosque or church, they will generally have a religious ceremony. And so again, in China, either you have a very secular ceremony or you have no one under the age of 18 present at your wedding. So this is an issue too. And then of course, religious literacy. I think we don't notice it as much in the US because it is so much a part of US culture. Where do you draw the line between sending children to a religious school, between sending them to Sunday school or Quranic classes, having religious texts at home, discussing religious figures? Most American children will know, Jonah and the whale, or they'll know some like Bible stories. These are even parts of children's literature in the US. So I think we have to place ourselves somewhere along the spectrum. Should we just erase all religious elements and, no one can talk about Jonah and the whale until they're 18? Do we not send children to Sunday school? Do we not have religious texts at home? Do we only have secular weddings? Where is that line?
Thank you.
I just want to say it's just so true about biblical literacy, and just what that means for just literacy. If you're at least going to approach the Western canon, it's quite. I see it in my own children make references because we didn't raise them with religion, and make references like, well, we didn't read the Bible, so I don't know what you're talking about when you say Job. So yeah.
So this actually links up with the question that Tim Hall has sent in about the importance of religious literacy and supporting religious freedom. And I suppose more generally that means if one knows about the meaning of different religions, the values of different religions, does that enhance your tolerance for religious freedom, or does it make you more suspicious? That's an interesting question. The more you know about other religions, are you in fact more likely to support religious freedom? Any thoughts on that?
Actually, when I read his question, I actually read it as like religious literacy in one's own religious heritage. And I think Max and I actually had an interesting conversation after our talks last night, where he said the French, when the French went into Algeria, they kind of, and forgive me if I'm a little bit wrong, standardized Sunni Islam in the mosques in Algeria. And they actually ended up leading to the cultivation of people who were more orthodox than they had been before. And this has happened in Turkey as well. The state went in, the secular state, and said, okay, we're going to have a standardized version of Islam in the mosques. And of course, today, you have people who are much more orthodox than they were 100 years ago when the state implemented this policy. And I think we've seen that a little bit in China too, so state education can actually, standardization and this fear of extremism can actually lead to, we've seen it across Central Asia, we've seen this where people I used to live in Kyrgyzstan, where Kyrgyz people are saying, these aspects of Kyrgyz culture are not actually standard Islam. We should start to eradicate them. So we've started to see more women wearing the kind of Arabic hijab, which was not common to Kyrgyzstan before. So it's a very strange, it's a very difficult question. And of course, in Xinjiang, there's this tension between people who want to know more about their own religion and then people who want to impose kind of external orthodox versions of this religion on Uyghurs, and then the state coming in and also telling them to practice a more orthodox version of Islam. But of course, this can have consequences that the state doesn't intend. So.
Yeah, just one thing I want to say about, because I think Tim Hall, and thank you for that. I mean, it's interesting how state policy ends up in many ways. Like we have a large Islamic modernist nationalist movement that grows up in the 1920s and 30s. That's has a much stricter understanding of Islam and really went against the French state. Very interesting point. But Tim Hall wrote that he is talking about literacy between religions, and that seems to go back again to my kind of utopian opening, which is that it's a matter of empathy. If you understand other people's religious beliefs and you are literate about what it is and what it means to them, and there's sort of transparency about belief across, you might have more respect and empathy for them. But here's the problem: that is required of everybody, right? And so if you're going to have this situation, you're going to have it, everybody's going to be empathetic with everyone else. And you're really asking everyone to kind of give up the absolute truth thing, right? And accept, at least in the context of society and culture and where we live in the day to day, that it is kind of relative. There's this relativity going on there. And that's, of course, really difficult to ask for some traditions that are very much based on absolute truth, and this is it, there's only one way. But I do think absolutely, in a general sense, being literate across traditions, and you see this in the way that religion is taught in public schools, when religions of the world or something like that, where you're learning about them in this sort of from the perspective of a cultural lens. I think it would help navigate the issues of religious liberty, but you're never going to stop the true believers, if you will.
Well, it's true that religion is different from some other forms of thought in that people do think they have a higher truth, and it's very difficult then to see all religions as equal approaches to that truth. So I wanted to ask one final question, because in each of the societies we've talked about, there's been a particular hostility for Muslims in recent decades. And I think one of the complaints among the people who say they're fearful of Muslims is they say Islamic societies are also hostile toward non-Muslim religion. You see, the paradox is the complaint about Muslims and the need to repress, in some cases, Muslims, is the claim that Muslims don't really favor religious freedom. There's a strange paradox there. Do you see what I mean? What about this? Is there a comparable hostility for non-Muslim religions in predominantly Muslim countries that is similar to the hostility for Islam in China or France or the United States?
I would just say it depends on the country, right? It depends. And, and I think the biggest problem is that Islam is a huge religion that is decentralized, has thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of modes of expression, hundreds might be, but many different modes of expression. And so we flatten difference and say Muslim, and that's just absolutely like we talked about the Muslim community in France. A lot of them are secularizing, a lot of them are very much assimilating, quote unquote, all of this stuff, but you flatten out difference and do that. Absolutely. Is Saudi Arabia good for religious liberty? Oh no, and there are plenty of sects, just like there are plenty of Christian sects that are very intolerant. Just so, it's the problem is that it's talk about religious literacy. The people that are enacting Muslim bans, or in particularly sort of broad brushing Islam, are not literate on what Islam is.
That's an excellent point. The attack on Islam is filled with generalizing stereotypes, but this is a problem in many cultures as well. Joanna, you want to? I'll give you the last word, on Ariane, because we've got to wrap up.
Well, I mean, I completely agree with Max said. I think it totally depends on the country, but what I would add is that I think this is pinning a problem on religion that is actually just a human problem, which is that when one group has a ton of power, they often use it to violently suppress minorities. We see that with or without religion, and we see that across traditions. So simply because we happen to be seeing it in some countries with Islam right now, it's a very ahistorical analysis of that to say Islam is the problem.
Thank you. A final thought, Ariane?
Yeah, of course, I would agree with Joanna. It's not, there is no, it's like Islam, Christianity, and Judaism are all these three religions of the book. They're very closely related. When you look at some of the core principles, they're actually quite similar. And I think, of course, when we get into problems with religious freedom, it's not because of the core principles of these religions. It's how they're being interpreted and how they're being used in the political sphere.
Okay, well, I think that is a wonderful way to wrap this up. That we all have one-dimensional approaches to this in some ways, and we need to keep thinking of the multiple layers and also the long historical evolution of these issues. I want to conclude by thanking Paul Bonnici for his work on all of the technology, always the maestro behind the scene who makes this happen. Thank you, Paul. I thank Joanna for her participation, Max for your participation, Ariane for your outstanding presentation on the Uyghurs. And thanks to all of you who have joined us for this seminar. We hope to see you again soon at a CPH event, including this coming Wednesday, I believe we have. Is that right, Max? Could you remind us one more time?
Yes, Margaret Foster from Political Science will be coming to talk about gig economies and radical movements around the world. And we're going to be touching on religious bodies as well in this talk. So if you're interested in looking at this, come and check it out. That's Wednesday at 3:30, Humanities in Action. Go to humanities.unc.edu. And Lloyd, since I have the microphone, I want to thank you for an excellent job moderating today. And fielding questions and for holding the fort down there at Flyleaf Books.
Well, it's always a pleasure to be a Flyleaf, and I encourage all of you to go out freely into the world and pursue truth in whatever way you need to for the rest of the day. Have a wonderful weekend. We'll see you again soon. Goodbye.